Hi, I'm here from an academy where we teach people how to grow and protect their wealth. Today, we're going to be discussing the first chapter of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which is titled The Rich Don't Work for Money. This is an incredible book, and I highly suggest you go out and read it. But if you don't have time to read the book, then you might want to watch this video because we're going to summarize the key points for you. Let's jump in. So, in this first chapter, we're introduced to the two dads. We have Robert's real dad, who he refers to as Poor Dad, and his best friend's dad, who he refers to as Rich Dad. Poor Dad was a highly educated man, held a PhD, and was employed by the government. Despite his intelligence and education, he was constantly struggling financially and never really got ahead. On the other hand, Rich Dad was a high school dropout who became one of the richest men in Hawaii. Now, Robert is curious to understand why his real dad was struggling financially despite being so smart and educated. And his mom also had a good job, so he asks his real dad, "How can I get rich?" His real dad says, "Well, use your head," but he doesn't really know how to answer the question. So Robert goes to Rich Dad and asks him. Now, Rich Dad doesn't answer the question either. Instead, he hires Robert and his friend Mike to work at one of his grocery stores. He pays them 10 cents an hour to dust cans and stock shelves. So Robert starts working at this grocery store, and after a couple weeks, he gets frustrated. He feels like he's not learning anything, and he's certainly not getting rich. So he goes back to Rich Dad and he tells him, "I want to quit." That's when Rich Dad says, "You already have learned the most important lesson I wanted to teach you." Now, Robert says, "I don't understand." And Rich Dad says, "Let me explain. If you work for money, you give up control of your life to your employer. Rich people don't work for money. They make money work for them. So let's talk about the main points from this chapter. Point no. 1 is that emotions control most people's lives. Now, Rich Dad explains that the poor and the middle class tend to be controlled by their emotions when it comes to money. And the reason that they're controlled by their emotions is because they lack financial education. They don't know how money works, so instead, they make decisions based on fear and greed. So, for example, let's say you work for $50,000 a year and you get a raise of $5,000, you might feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. However, that feeling of satisfaction won't last very long. In fact, according to Rich Dad, that feeling of satisfaction is only temporary. And after a month or two, you're back to where you started. You're back to being controlled by your emotions. And now you're focused on the next raise. And that's how you spend your whole life trading time for money. Now, Rich Dad explains that fear drives you to work and greed drives you to spend. Now, fear is this overwhelming feeling of anxiety that you get when you imagine yourself being broke or homeless or not having enough money. And greed is this intense desire for more money, more success, more recognition. And both of these emotions tend to keep people stuck in the middle class. Now, if you're driven by fear, you tend to be risk-averse. You always play it safe. You never really step outside your comfort zone. And if you're driven by greed, you might take big risks, but those risks tend to be reckless. Now, both of these tendencies tend to limit your potential. According to statistics, 80% of the people watching this video right now are living paycheck to paycheck. And the reason for that is because they're letting their emotions dictate how they manage their finances. Here's the thing, fear and greed control most people, but rich people control their emotions. How do they do this? Well, they do it through financial education. By learning how money works, they become less fearful of running out of money. And at the same time, they become less greedy because they realize there's an unlimited amount of money out there. And the more they learn, the more they realize that money is not a problem. The only problem is a lack of financial education. In fact, Rich Dad says that the main cause of financial struggle is not the economy, not the government, not the rich, it's fear and ignorance. Now, here's the thing. After Robert learns this lesson, he thinks that he's learned the most important lesson from Rich Dad. But Robert is wrong. Rich Dad says, "No, you haven't learned the most important lesson yet. So stay tuned for our next episode where we're going to continue the series. We're going to discuss the most important lesson that Robert learned from Rich Dad.